Hello and welcome, fellow bad strategists. In this video, I'm going to be covering the topic of threat assessment in Burning Wheel. When you see that beefy, meaty barbarian wielding his two-handed axe looking down at you, how do you know if you are actually in danger in Burning Wheel, right? Because Burning Wheel is simultaneously a game which relies very heavily on fictional positioning and what's going on within the narrative of the story, and also is kind of crunchy at times, right? And how do you know how that fiction translates into the crunch? So, let's talk about it, right? Let's talk about that and try to figure it out. So, if you see someone, average person on the street, the peddler, right, trying to shove their wares on you, how strong are they? Well, the average person in Burning Wheel is strength 3, right? But you can't ask the GM that, right? You can't be like, "Hey GM, that fellow over there, I'm thinking about getting in a fight with him. What's his power score? What is his power attribute at?" The GM is going to scoff at you and say, "You don't know his power attribute. That's ridiculous." But there's a trick, right? There is a trick to this, right? Because you don't know his power attribute, but your character knows the fictional positioning within the story, within the fiction at the table. Your character knows that. So you look at him and you ask the GM, "Hey, GM, how strong's that guy look?" GM says, he looks especially weak and frail, right? Like, he looks pretty malnourished and thin." Well, then he's power 2. He's crippled. Well, he's power 1, probably. GM says, "No, he looks like an ordinary guy." Well, that's power 3. He's a meaty soldier type. That's power 4. He looks especially strong, stronger than most fellows. He's power 5. He looks huge and intimidating. He is a mighty hulk of a man. Well, he's power 6, maybe even higher. But don't expect anyone to be higher than power 6. That's pretty significant. So now you got some questions. You can ask the GM about their strength, and you can convert that fictional situation in your brain into the stats, into the numbers at the table that are going to matter in play. Now let's look at this, right. Let's say, you know what, let's say it's an average person, power 3, and let's see what that means in terms of the damage they can deal to you. Is this person going to accidentally kill you if they get in a fistfight with you? This average strength peddler? Well, how would we know? Let's assume, right, they're punching you, right? It's a fist fight. How is their power converted into damage? Well, if they get one success on their die roll, they can use that success to match the obstacle of the die roll, which is almost always 1, right? If you're trying to strike someone, it's usually obstacle 1. And then let's say they have more successes, right? For every 2 additional successes, they can buy up their power to increase their damage. The only exception to this rule is a dagger, I believe. A dagger only requires 1 success. And a person can buy up their damage up to twice, but not more than twice, right? If they don't buy up their damage, it's called an incidental hit. If they do buy up their damage once, it's a mark hit, and if they buy up their damage twice, it is a superb hit. Now, brawling. Punching is different from weapons combat in Burning Wheel in that with punching, if you land an incidental hit, you only apply half of your power rounded up. So, let's say this peddler punches you. They're only dealing 2 points of damage, and you look at your grayscale and you see, well, that doesn't hit the superficial threshold, so you just ignore that. That's not enough damage to actually hurt you. Well, that's nice, right? If they don't buy up the damage, they can't actually hurt your character. It's a small enough amount of damage that you ignore it. Now, with punching, if you buy up the damage once, it increases it from being half your power rounded up to your full power. Okay, so if they punch you like this, then they could conceivably deal a superficial wound to you, which increases your obstacle by 1 for all tests, except for resources and circles, but those don't really matter here. You're probably not going to be doing those in the middle of this fight unless you are in a real desperate place, right? Okay, so yeah, superficial, that's not really a big deal. You can get over superficial wound in like an hour in game. It's not a big deal. But if they buy it up not just 1 time to increase their full power, but 2 times, then they add half their power rounded up again. So half their power rounded up again is going to bump that up to a light wound. Now, light wounds are interesting, right? Because you cannot lose consciousness from superficial wounds. You cannot be incapacitated by superficial wounds. But light wounds can do that to you. Technically, I would say that, mechanically speaking, a superficial wound is more detrimental than a light wound is, because a superficial wound adds 1 to your obstacle for every test that you roll. And an obstacle is going to be... Dice have a 50-50 chance of succeeding in Burning Wheel. If you have Black Shade, which you have Black Shade on everything, don't even ignore Gray Shade and White Shade, you have a 50-50 chance of succeeding. So 1 obstacle means that, on average, it's going to take 2 die to overcome that obstacle. Which means that an OB1 increase is kind of similar to losing 2 die. So then why is it that a light wound is only -1 die, right? Like, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But here's the thing. This is not a reduction to your die pool exclusively. This is a reduction to everything on your character sheet. Meaning that all of your stats go down by 1 point, all of your physical and mental attributes, which means that if you drop to 0, you can drop to 0 with this on your mental attributes or your physical attributes. If that happens, you are incapacitated or lose consciousness. And that can be nasty, right? That can be real bad. You don't want to lose consciousness in the middle of a fight to the death. That will not end well for you, right? So that is what makes these heavier wounds kind of scary in combat, right? Like, I would say light to severe wounds are kind of scary because of that. Traumatic and mortal wounds, I would say, are not scary so much because of that, but are more frightening because of the incredible recovery time required and the potential crippling severity of the injury, right? Like, a midi wound could become permanent, and a severe wound could become permanent, but a traumatic and a mortal wound, you're going to be fighting to keep that from becoming a permanent part of your character, right? And they won't become fully permanent. You won't permanently lose 5 die from everything, but you might lose half the penalty to a particular stat forever. And that's most distressing. So let's talk, before we talk about the die pool, let's talk about weapons, right? Because we talked about brawling, right? We talked about a strength 3 person hitting you, and we saw that they can't do much more than a light wound to you, which you can recover over a very short period of time in play. It's not a big deal if it's a light wound. Let's say they have a dagger. What does that mean in play? Well, a dagger means that if they deal an incidental hit to you, you remember an incidental hit is they meet their obstacle. So they get 1 success, the ob is 1, that's an incidental hit. An incidental hit means they use their full power, as opposed to brawling, where an incidental hit is half their power. So right off the bat, the weakest hit they can deal is a superficial wound. Now, remember, this grayscale is assuming you are power 4, fort 4. But against, like, a tough soldier, a standard person punching is going to be dealing a superficial wound if it's an incidental hit. Now, the way daggers work is kind of weird, right? Because it's the same thing, it's the same buy-up, right? You spend 2 successes to increase the power, but it's increased by the weapon power. And daggers only have 1 power, so if you spend 2 successes to increase it from an incidental to a mark hit, you're only going up by a point of damage. Spend 2 more successes, to 1 more point of damage. So a dagger is actually kind of on par with punching in terms of lethality. It's just, the big difference to bear in mind, though, is that because a dagger allows incidental hits to always apply your full power, daggers are easier to hurt people with. If you're a very strong character, though, you might be more capable of killing someone without a dagger than you are with a dagger, because let's say your power is up, let's give you the highest power you can give a character at creation of 6. If you have 6 power, then you're gonna half that will be 3 for a incidental hit, 6 for a mark hit, boom, and that's going to go up to 9 for a superb hit. So, strong characters can get away with not using daggers. However, it's easier for an unskilled fighter to hurt someone using a dagger, and getting a superb hit requires a lot of successes, right? Which means you need a big die pool. If you don't have a big die pool, it's hard to land those superb hits. But let's go up a step from that. From a dagger, let's look at the mace. Mace has 2 power. So, once again, the lightest hit with any weapon is always going to be your attacker power. It's a superficial wound. A mace, you buy your power up once, it's light. You buy it up again, it's midi. So maces are hitting harder, right? Because a superb hit with a mace can reduce your die pool by 2. And that means average person, 3 in all their stats, is going to be a light wound and a midi wound is enough to render them incapacitated most of the time. They're out of the fight at that point. If we bump this up to being a sword, you'll notice that these shift a little bit in a dangerous way. Because a traumatic wound from a superb hit is pretty bad, right? That's more than enough to incapacitate the average person. Like, 4 die. That's really nasty, and you're going to have a hard time being treated from a superb hit with a sword. And as you can see, if the attacker power bumped up by a point, if this were a soldier swinging, then suddenly death is on the line. And suddenly a mark hit is enough to incapacitate the average person. That's pretty scary. And let's go back. Let's say it's still a, did I do that wrong? I think I shifted that wrong. I apologize. The shifting, it would actually have been a midi wound, but whatever. Okay. Let's assume that the weapon power goes up, right? Let's assume they have an axe, a big 2-handed axe, or they are using a polearm, right? They have a pole axe, and they want to whack you with the axe blade. This table shifts like this. The mark wound is midi for you. 2 die reduction to all your pools. Significantly reduces your combat effectiveness right off the bat. And even a weak character, even a physically weak character, is able to kill or very nearly kill you with a good hit. But here's the thing, right? I keep bringing this up. I keep going back to this. It's a good hit is enough to kill you. An incidental hit will, with any weapon, not be killing you, right? It's not going to hurt you that badly to take an incidental hit. Even an absurdly strong character, an incidental hit is only going to be landing around 6. And this character is an ogre. That's a light wound. It's a midi wound for the average person, but it's probably a light wound for your character. So that's the thing, right? Is they need lots of excess successes to make the hit powerful enough to really disable you and to shut you down. So if you want to assess a threat of an enemy, of another character in the world, right, you look at their weapon power to determine how much potential damage they can deal to you, right? And you look at their strength to see how much is added to the damage. And you look at their die pool. You look at how good a fighter are they to determine the probability that they will deal that damage to you. I have made a spreadsheet to demonstrate this, right? Now if we tweak fort and power, you can see the colors become colder. Colder on this sheet tends to indicate like lighter wounds, less nasty things. Ignore that I made mortal wounds purple. That doesn't matter. But yeah, right, like if the enemy's power is lower, the odds of getting in this blue area, blue being something you ignore, get drastically higher. If they're a soldier and you're, let's say 4-4, right? You are a soldier and they are a soldier. Then we can see if they're punching you, 0 strength, they're probably not going to be dealing to you a light wound, right? This nice, or this midi wound, this nice yellow shade that is midi, is not really going to be happening. It looks like with a 5-die pool, they'll be dealing a superficial wound to you, which is not that big a deal. They can deal light wounds to you if they have... They can deal light wounds to you if they get lucky with these die pool, which will happen on occasion. But the average hit with a 5-die pool is gonna be a superficial wound. If they start rolling 8-die though, if you encounter someone who is an expert at what they're doing, and they're hitting you and they're as strong as a soldier, you're going to be taking light wounds in a brawl. If they have a dagger, the chance of them inflicting meaningful injuries somewhat increases. And if they have a mace, suddenly, at a 5-die pool, 6-die pool, we see the point at which their average hits are going to start being midi hits, right? They can deal a superb hit with a 5-die pool. It's just very unlikely. It'll happen, but it's not going to happen consistently unless you are very unlucky. And when a sword comes into play, the lethality of your opponent, even with a small die pool, really increases. If they have an axe, then you are in trouble, even if they don't have a lot of strength. So you've got to know your own tolerances, right? If you make a character with 6 fort, your tolerances are vastly greater, and you've got to know what weapon they're using and how strong they are and how skilled they are. The skill is going to be the most difficult to know in the fiction, right? Because you won't know skill unless you see them in action, or you hear about them, right? If you hear about someone being a tremendously good fighter, so let's actually look at what would make a skilled fighter, right? Average person's going to be 3, a soldier is going to be 4, a very talented fighter will be 5, and like an expert near mastery 6. But there's another factor. Everyone can switch into an offensive stance, which is +2 die. Meaning, even this lowly peasant, who's not too good at fighting, can muster a 5-die pool if they're on the offense. So if we look at the 5 and track that down the line, you can see in melee, probably not so threatening. With a dagger, there's some danger of you getting pretty badly hurt. With a mace, still some danger, and we're kind of on the threshold of them dealing some significant wounds to you. And with a sword, if they get a lucky hit, you're going down. And with an axe, oh dear, don't let this person hit you with an axe. An average person with an axe is going to shut you down. They're going to, like, it's very, very dangerous. Now, you might cut them down in the first swing, but there's a lot of threat here. So let's shift this over and think, how can we counteract this in play, right? Because surely we're not going to run every time someone with an axe shows up. We're not going to be so cowardly that when we see an unskilled peasant with an axe, we see someone with only 2 die, right? Someone who's just inept with weapons, go on the offensive carrying an axe, that we're just going to flee from them. That'd be ridiculous. That'd be absurd. So what do? Well, you look at your fictional positioning, right? Or, well, let's look at our mechanical positioning, actually. This is a vibe for a position test. Our literal positioning in the battle. essentially, you roll your speed, they roll their speed, and the winner gets to choose the distance between you two. Now, if your opponent is rolling 4 die, and let's say you are rolling 5 die, then increasing the obstacle is going to hurt them more than it hurts you. So why don't you intentionally put yourself too close to them? Put yourself at a position where you both suffer an obstacle penalty for your weapons. 2 extra die because instead of fighting at long range, where their axe is effective, you decide to fight at shortest range. You both get 2 ob, but that means that the best case scenario for them, every die succeeds, leaves them with only 1 extra success after they buy the ob, which means this extra success can't buy up their power. They're only dealing their base power. But you, in the same scenario, could, like 5 die, you'd have an extra die, you would be able to up your power. If you have more die than them, then this obstacle helps you more than it hurts them. So that's a good way to control the engagement, right? But let's say you fail the speed test. You fail your positioning test, so you're not in a good spot to increase their obstacle, and you're in danger. What do, right? You don't want to get killed by this axe. There's a huge threat that they'll just land a solid blow, take your head off, something bad. Well, there are a number of moves that can help with this, right? You could, if you have high power, attempt to tackle them right off the bat. You get a bonus die for that. If you tackle them, you change the engagement range from whatever it's at to the shortest engagement range, which is going to give them that increased obstacle, assuming they have a long weapon. Or it will also potentially knock them down, which will increase their obstacle even further. Being knocked down is generally 2 extra points of ob. So you can see, like, that would immediately disable them. They're not able to hurt you if you knock them down and put them at that shorter range. Or you could try to disarm them, but disarming is extremely difficult unless you have a very large die pool, right? And there's no halfway on disarming. If you don't meet their weapon skill, which admittedly against an unskilled opponent, there's a good chance, if they're skill 2 and you are weapon skill 4 or 5, you can probably disarm them pretty reliably. So that's an option. Or you could shift into a defensive stance. Now, the way defensive stance works is it's like an offensive stance, but of course, obviously, the die go to your defensive pool, and defensive stance, switching to defensive stance, counts as a block action. So you're protected whilst changing stances. And blocking is less reliable than increasing your opponent's obstacle, right? But blocking is helpful. So what you can do is you essentially shift to a defensive stance. You get extra die. So when you block, you roll more die than you otherwise would. And if your die are successes, each successful die goes into the obstacle pool for your opponent's attack. Meaning, in best case scenario, they cannot possibly get through a hit because you're so good at blocking. Admittedly, it's a double-edged sword, right? Because whilst it's a great way to shut down your opponent's offensive capabilities, it functions kind of like the range and cover mechanic, in that even if you have a huge pool of die to roll, every once in a while you're going to see, oh dear, I only got 1 success. And that's when you're in danger, right? When your opponent rolls well and you roll poorly. So I would recommend using defensive stance as a means of delaying your opponent, right? It's not going to keep you alive forever, but if your opponent's in too strong a position for you to contest, try to buy some time with blocking and defenses so that you can vie for position and hopefully win. And when you win the positioning test, hammer them. Hit them as hard as you can. Because that is where you have your advantage. So yeah, that's it, right? How do you know if someone's a threat? You ask, how strong do they look? Are they especially weak? Are they pretty average in build? Are they pretty strong like a soldier? Are they exceptionally strong, right? Real beefcake? Or are they some titanous, huge, hulking mound of a person? And then ask, what are they holding? Is it just their fists? If it's just their fists, then you know the maximum damage they can deal. If it's a dagger, well, their skill's gonna matter less, right? They'll be able to get damage through more reliably with any weapon than they could with their fists. A talented fist fighter could potentially kill you if they're strong, though. Is it a mace? Be a little maces, not too scary, but they'll get through armor more effectively. A sword, that's dangerous. You don't want to be hit by a sword. Real risk there. Or an axe. God forbid it be a skilled fighter with an axe or a polearm. You do not want to get hit by that. Look at the fiction, ask questions that are laid down in the fiction of the world, right? If you ask your GM the power of the enemy, he will give you a dirty look. Ask him how strong they are. Ask if you know anything about how skilled they are. Have you heard about them? Do they look like a soldier? Do they look like they've been trained? Are they shivering? Are they shaking? Are they confident? Try to guess their die pool. Try to guess their power. And know what their weapon is. And then know your own tolerances, right? Because if you have 6 power and 6 fort, then suddenly even a sword isn't that scary for you. But an axe will always be scary. Don't fight axes. They're intimidating. I really hope this has been helpful for all of you. This is Bad Strategy signing out. Have a nice night, everyone. Good luck with your Burning Wheel.